Hello and welcome to Orthodox Shahada. The title of this video is Right Use of Philosophy in Religious Worldviews, Avoiding the Cheap Polemic. It is often the case in Muslim-Christian religious discourse that the Islamic side will enjoy holding up the Gorgon's head of quote-unquote philosophy to petrify his Christian interlocutor. Case in point.
This concept of Trinity, triune God, or God becoming a man, and even dying for one's sins, these concepts did exist prior to Christianity, and they existed within paganism.
I do want to point out that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the Trinity specifically rejects this claim when it's applied to the Trinity. There is a book called The Gospel in the Greeks by Ronald Nash. He actually does a critical examination of the claim that Christianity borrowed elements of Hellenistic philosophy and religion. So if you want a scholarly examination of that claim, I would recommend trying to get a hold of that book.
Brilliant, but I'm pretty sure you would acknowledge that the terms ousia, the terms prosopon, the terms, all of these metaphysical terms are taken from Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy. The Christian church fathers who first to coin them, they were just using them as they existed.
Well, they were using Greek language, obviously.
Language is philosophy, metaphysics.
Yeah, because I'm sure you're familiar with the difference between the use of language and the use of like the actual ontology that is associated with that language. Because as a lot of people have argued, the New Testament authors, for example, would use terms that were common to the Greeks, but they would also import Hebraic ideas into them. So they would use the term logos, but underneath the use of the word logos, they would also have the concept of like the Devar Adonai as found in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, that doesn't really detract from the point that I made, because I don't doubt that there was syncretism. That is the entire point of Brother Abbas's argument, that there was syncretism between Christian, Greco-Roman, and Jewish ideas. And so I would point out, for example, that the idea of the word becoming incarnate is fully and absolutely within Greek metaphysics, possible at least, because you have an accident within a substance. Jesus being the accident within the substance, humanity within a divinity. So there you go.
Brandishing about accusations surrounding this or that church father or religious text invoking philosophical categories which are greatly indebted to Hellenic, that is Greek pagan philosophy, is counterproductive to actual Muslim-Christian dialogue. Not least because some of the most celebrated Islamic theologians in history have themselves done the exact same thing, a small fraction of which will be covered on a video series that we're working on, as well as there being no shortage of ink spilled and time spent on the alleged pagan influences in the Quran and Islamic praxis, to wit, the Blackstone and Company. What further increases the irony is the fact that even among Muslims such as Ash'ari and Maturidis, and so-called Salafis, the Gorgon's head is equally reared. However, there are far more important reasons for the counterproductivity of this approach, which we will discuss in this video. If you would like to come discuss the contents of any of our videos, please join the Discord through the link I will put in the comments. Please like, share, subscribe, and without further ado, let's go. Let's start with some questions and definitions. These are definitions that can be reviewed, but I think they are a good place to start. I have defined dogma as, quote, a truth-bearing proposition which cannot be rejected, contradicted, or compromised for some reason, unquote. Such a reason could be conditioned by a religious obligation, such as some grievous sin which causes loss of salvation, expulsion from the religion, or apostasy. But this could apply even to non-religious groups such as perhaps modern-day liberal progressivism, to wit, being cancelled, or some such reason. Hence, I have defined a religious worldview to be, quote, a system of belief which contains a body of revealed dogmatic truths, unquote. A body can be one or more dogmas, but I think this one is fairly self-explanatory. And the questions we want to ask ourselves are, does philosophy, whatever that is, have a place in religious worldviews? And also, can anyone reject philosophy? i.e., is it possible to simply do away completely with philosophy in our belief system? So let's use these definitions and our brains to answer these questions. So what is philosophy and what is quote-unquote philosophy? The word philosophy comes from its Greek roots philo, meaning love, and sophia, meaning wisdom. It broadly constitutes the seeking after wisdom and knowledge. Philosophy, as I will more specifically define it, is the inquiry into what reality is, how we know what constitutes reality, and how we ought to act or how we should behave ourselves. These form the three main branches of philosophy, that is, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Again, these classifications can be reviewed, but I think this is the case. Philosophy, quote-unquote, when criticized by religious worldviews, including by church fathers and Islamic theologians alike, concerns the answers to those three questions which are contrary to the dogmatic views of their religion, or which are otherwise harmful to the believer. St. Paul in his letter to the Colossians warns, quote, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ." Unquote. Paul is not here warning against philosophy as properly defined, but rather against philosophy as something that is akin to a fancy of the imagination, or as an invention of individual fallible men, which does not lead towards the greater knowledge of Christ. In keeping with this, consider how St. John of Damascus relates on the topic of philosophy in his work called The Philosophical Chapters. Quote, "Philosophy is knowledge of things which are insofar as they are, that is, a knowledge of the nature of things which have being. And again, philosophy is knowledge of both human and divine things, that is to say, of things both visible and invisible. Still again, philosophy is the making of oneself like God. Now we become like God in wisdom, which is to say in true knowledge of good, and in justice, which is a fairness in judgment without respect to persons, and holiness, which is to say in goodness, which is superior to justice, being that by which we do good to them that wrong us. Philosophy is the art of arts, and the science of sciences. This is because philosophy is the principle of every art, since through it every art and science has been invented. Philosophy again is love of wisdom, but true wisdom is God. Therefore the love of God is the true philosophy." Unquote. We will explain more later about this idea of the love of God being the true philosophy. In the meantime, St. John goes on to explain a like division among branches of philosophy to that which I have given. Notice how John speaks about philosophy involving the study of reality, or the nature of the things which have being, and further speaks about justice and goodness, which are fundamentally tied to ethics, which he goes on to further expound in the same chapter. These things ultimately culminate in what philosophy is in its true sense, and what led St. John in his Dialectica to call philosophy the handmaid of theology. Quote, "Since every craftsman used tools, he, Damascene, argued, so it was right for a queen to be ministered to by servants. Thus it was legitimate to use anything that saved the truth, by means of which we could repulse impiety." Unquote. Hence, the one who brandishes philosophy as a scare word to stifle dialogue has already committed several fallacies, commencing with the genetic fallacy, namely that just because some categories, beliefs, and principles have much of their origin in pagan thought, that these ideas are therefore de facto wrong. The truthhood or falsehood of these categories, principles, and beliefs is not negated by the source from which they are drawn, especially when their current or contextual use is ignored. The error is to take the presuppositions of these thinkers wholesale, which we will speak about shortly, as well as treating them as authorities on philosophical or theological matters. Next, it constitutes a kind of informal fallacy of poisoning the well. That is, the polemicist intends to use the dirty word philosophy to tar his opponent as someone whose well or source of belief is poisoned by something toxic, namely philosophy, which is merely being used as a smear word, a spooky term, to discredit the arguments themselves. Finally, it is the word concept fallacy, which is the idea that because the same word is used, therefore the meaning and intent must be identical in both cases, despite the different context. For example, the word son, when referred to a human child, does not mean the exact same thing when used to refer to the Son of God. The former implies passivity, temporality, contingency, matter, and physico-biological parents. In a similar manner, the word speech, when referred to a human oration, does not have the same meaning as the speech of Allah. We can therefore see that words are not theory neutral. There is no inherent neutrality to words. So when the word philosophy is used both in a context where it was being referred to negatively and one where it is referred to positively, it does not follow that the meaning intended is the same in both contexts. This is why Imam al-Ghazali can write a work called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, without it being a repudiation of philosophy properly understood and properly defined. Professor Cornelius van Lith, from the University of Leiden, who is a specialist in Islamic philosophy, explains this well.
If they are called mutakallimun, are they then by definition sort of less interesting or I think at first, at least, definitely this has been an issue for people to break through, to see that mutakallimun are in fact philosophers. They are not just theologians in the specific sense of theology, but let's face it, these mutakallimun were discussing all kinds of issues that have to do with physics, with epistemology, with ontology. So this is of everybody's interest. To make a final point, very important. In the end, I think, just much like I said about the terms, the Asharites and Maturidis, a term like falasifa and even a term like mutakallimun, they are not really meant to be placed on a person. It's not meant to say like huwa min al-falasifa. Al-falasifa is merely a system of thought. It's a bundle of ideas. The Tahafut al-falasifa is not meant to be full-on criticism of philosophy. So I think it really, you're right. It does bear mentioning tonight that the real intention was to in fact show the potential of philosophy, to show the strength of philosophy, and to then show that that there are still certain things that may look like philosophy, but in fact when you look at the logic behind these ideas, like the eternity of the world, for example, then these ideas fall flat and they are wrong. But there's so much else in philosophy that is of great value. So I thank you very much for mentioning this.
Thank you for this interesting lecture. My name is Sharif. I'm an instructor of philosophy. I guess I'll go back to the main issue you're mentioning, which is the somehow theology-philosophy distinction. I guess like I've read for Frank Griffel, he wrote like in his book about Ghazali's philosophical theology, that somehow after Ghazali, philosophy moved into theology. I mean, like philosophy did not die, but it just moved within the writings of theologists. And my question is for you, if you take a very general look at, for instance, like Ash'arites, what they do with the writings of Avicenna, for instance, like his introduction of what they call modal logic, and how actually they use it to prove the existence of God, you find that this, a philosophy-theology distinction melt down directly. It's really clear that actually they use each other's idea and they develop it. So I mean, the whole fight or the whole debate between these two general categories, somehow I feel it's very artificial. But they don't just overcome this kind of debate and just dig into something else. I mean, this is a general question. Thank you so much.
Yes. So your basic question is if these labels, including al-falasifa and mutakallimun, are so meaningless in terms of identifying a group of people, and that there is really not an actual conflict going on.
There is no actual way of distinguishing. They use the same techniques, same tools, everything.
Then your question is, then why do we still focus on it? And I think this goes back to the very beginning of the lecture. This is, I think, still the way to contribute meaningful knowledge about Islam, exactly to use these terms and then to show that there is much more going on and that we need to break through these terms. But the terms themselves we simply have to use because this is the wider world that we live in, and these are the more general remarks made about Islam, that philosophy was sort of put in its place by theology, and that somehow that's a bad thing or something, and that somehow means that there was no intellectually stimulating thought going on. So I think that's why it's still important to come back to this.
And Frank Griffel, a professor of Islamic studies at Yale University, also makes a very similar statement.
The position that I have taken with regard to Al-Ghazali is somewhat a part of a larger re-evaluation of the philosophical tradition in Islam. Mm-hmm. The classical view that was put forward by our early great scholars in the field of Islamic studies, who worked mostly at the beginning of the 20th century, and this view was then also shared by Arab and Muslim thinkers, was that Islamic philosophy in Islam, Arabic philosophy, which was pursued in Islam, was very lively and very active until a certain point in time when the culture somewhat has given up this activity. Mm-hmm. And the prejudice was that, and in this case, an occupation more with religious literature, particularly with the Quran, actually has replaced the rationalist inquiry of the philosophers. By now, we think that this is only half of the story. Mm-hmm. It is true that there was a lively thriving of philosophy, of the tradition of Greek philosophy within Islam, but it is also true that at one point, this tradition was turned over, so to speak, from the philosophical discourse to the theological discourse. And my position is that Al-Ghazali actually took a very important position in this turning of philosophy into what we call kalam literature, which is rationalist theological literature. The traditionalist view, however, is totally different by basically saying that Al-Ghazali destroyed the tradition of falsafa. He, in fact, wrote a very important book which criticizes many teachings of the Arabic philosophers, most importantly amongst them the philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. And this particular book wasn't very deeply studied. One read the beginning, one read the end, and draw from it the conclusion that it was an all-out refutation of the philosophical tradition, which it clearly wasn't. In fact, it was one part and one parcel, one might say, of the oeuvre of Al-Ghazali, which was, to some degree, criticizing philosophical tradition, yet on the other hand also integrating much of what he does not criticize, in this case, into the Islamic theological discourse.
This is again reinforced by Professor Michael Marmura from the University of Toronto's Department of Middle East and Islamic Studies in his introduction to the bilingual text of the Tahafut, Incoherence, where he states, quote, "The Tahafut also marks a high point in the history of medieval Arabic thought because of its intellectual caliber. Although its motivation is religious and theological, it makes its case through closely argued criticisms that are ultimately philosophical," unquote. That is not to say that all the philosophical positions Al-Ghazali took in his Tahafut were his per se, though some were, and he further expounds his philosophical theology in other works. So let us discuss how philosophy functions as a handmaid to theology and the role of religious worldviews in this. Islam and Christianity, both being religious worldviews, are concerned with the preservation of their dogmas, yet also desire to be able to carefully explicate and expound these dogmas in the face of criticism. I made this diagram to visualize the concept. All pre-Christian and pre-Islamic philosophies, including Greek, Hindu, Chinese, etc., left over a number of categories and principles of rationalization, namely that by which some belief is explained or cashed out, which were used to explain what things are real, how we know what is real, and how we ought to act. I will henceforth refer to these categories and principles simply as ideas, since we have the relevant definition of philosophy and the three branches of philosophy as simply metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. These ideas would have been part of a larger philosophical system, but they could in principle fit in other systems with some modification. A brief example would be the late Platonic commentators who modified Aristotelian and Platonic concepts to fit their system. And if the mention of Chinese philosophy troubles my Orthodox audience, consider the book by Hieronymus Damascene titled Christ the Eternal Tao. Such treatment of philosophical ideas can be seen when it comes to the doctrine of the Most Holy Trinity. Dr. Stephen Hildebrand notes in his book on St. Basil, quote, "One must exercise caution, though, in attributing philosophical influence to the Christian understanding of the Trinity, and be wary about the attempts to trace St. Basil's use of a word back to earlier philosophical sources. As Adolf Martin Ritter writes, quote, according to the Cappadocians, divine ousia is not simply identical with one of the given concepts of ousia, whether Platonic, Stoic, or Aristotelian, unquote. In general, and in specific instances, the Cappadocians' indebtedness to Greek philosophy is undeniable. It would be a mistake, however, to deny them a certain creativity in their borrowing. Basil did not use the pagan philosophers with a view toward accurately preserving the integrity of their thought. On the contrary, he adapts, alters, and adjusts what he borrows, making it suitable to explain as far as possible the Christian mysteries. Concerning Basil in particular, Reinhard Hübner points out that, quote, a desire for speculation does not drive his Trinitarian theology, unquote. Basil, to be sure, applies philosophical words and concepts to the Godhead, but he is not in the business thereby of constructing a philosophical system of metaphysics or ontology, unquote. So what does drive St. Basil's Trinitarian theology? Well, the revealed dogmas from the biblical text and the tradition as handed down to him by the apostles. This is where the mentioned creativity is involved, in the right application of philosophy and philosophical concepts. J. Dyer corroborates this approach when he speaks about the Apostle John's Logos theology in an excellent video called Logic, Reason, and Their Relation to Philosophy and Creation, which I will link below along with the rest of the videos I quote in this video.
I want to talk to you about logos. This is a confused and often debated notion and topic in Scripture. So St. John's usage of the term, as I said, has been hotly debated. In fact, a lot of people read the Johannine prologue, as it's called, as a philosophical text, basically a means by which to philosophize Christianity. And for a long time, people said, well, this term, using this term, therefore means that Christianity is Hellenism, or it's been Hellenized. Well, actually, that's not true. Now, this has to be discussed because in a lot of circles online, Jordan Peterson does this, other people talk about logos, and they make it into logic or reason. That's not exactly what it is. If you notice, when John 1 described it, John said the logos is a he. He, logos, was in the beginning with God. This is very important because in Orthodox theology, personhood, hypostasis, hypostasis, this is a term that's specifically used to describe the who is doing a thing, right? Nature, physis, that describes the what. What is this thing that's doing this thing? That terminology is very important, and it's a terminological inheritance that we have from Revelation, from the New Testament, and from the New Testament's general usage of the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. And that's the reason I bring this up, is that when we speak of logos, we're not talking about necessarily Aristotle's syllogisms. Now, they're related. There is a relationship between Aristotle's usage of syllogisms, Plato's usage of logos. I have grad papers I wrote on the way Plato and Aristotle use these terms, but they're not exactly synonymous. They're not univocally used in the same senses. In Revelation, in our theology, the tradition from which John is drawing when he writes the prologue to the gospel is from the Septuagint. He's deriving his notions from the wisdom texts of the Old Testament. Wisdom is Sophia, right? It is philosophia. It is the love of life, the love of wisdom. The same thing, right? The examined life, we might say. But what Hellenism does, what Greek philosophy does, for example, is that it takes those concepts and it impersonalizes them. It abstracts them out of their revealed theological categories. John does the opposite. He takes it and he personalizes it.
Hence, these philosophical ideas are therefore indeterminate. And I represent them here with this brown mass, which I want you to imagine is a kind of amorphous plastic. But what determines which ideas are true? Well, that is the role of the religious worldview with its revealed dogmas to define, delineate, and determine which of these amorphous ideas are compatible. The religious worldview is therefore like a mould which can receive the amorphous plastic in a definite shape which does not itself degrade or compromise the mould, i.e. the religious worldview. To quote Dr. Bo Branson, this leads to the crazy concept often ignored by modern academics that committing to a particular theological tradition might doubly commit you to a particular metaphysics. However, commitment to certain philosophical presuppositions can compromise dogma. For example, the commitment to the eternality of matter can compromise the revealed doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or a presupposition about what is fitting for God can compromise how he relates to us, or a presupposition about what perfection in God might entail can compromise ideas about his sovereignty or revealed character. This is where the idea of paradigms intersects. The religious worldview with its dogmas as presupposed will be incompatible with certain erroneous presuppositions from non-revelatory philosophical discourse. This is why we at Orthodox Shahada prefer to address aspects of revealed theology which constitute fundamental presuppositions in religious traditions, rather than discourse over less fundamental issues, such as textual criticism, the moral character of religious figures like Muhammad, and additional traditions like the Hadith. It is not that these areas are unimportant, and we will do videos on these, but rather that addressing the central presuppositions in the worldview, those things which condition the metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, is of a higher order import and a higher order impact. This next bit is absolutely crucial to understand. As you can see in the diagram, since Christianity and Islam have different dogmatic molds and presuppositions due to their revelatory content, the ideas which can fit the mold are different and lead to a different shape of plastic, if you will. Hence, the cheap polemic can be thrown in both directions, since there will be ideas which have their origin in non-Islamic sources modified to accommodate the Islamic mold, which will be incompatible with the Christian mold. So to reiterate so we are clear, it is precisely because the molds themselves are different that they will determine the acceptability of different ideas in their respective orthodoxies. Considering the mold plastic composite, that is the worldview, in itself, and forming a critique grounded in its own base philosophical ideas and its own fundamental dogmas, is the essence of a paradigm-level critique. As George P. Klubertans, who was professor of philosophy at St. Louis University, states, quote, "A believer, because he has an intellect with an innate drive toward understanding, wants to understand the content of his faith as much as possible. The organized effort to understand faith is called theology, and a large part of scientific theology consists in the use of philosophical principles and methods to help in the understanding of faith. On the other hand, historically speaking, faith has helped philosophy. For example, a man who believes what the Christian revelation has to tell him about the nature of God cannot make the philosophical error that thinking God is an impersonal force. Theology thus is a negative form for philosophy, inasmuch as man's faith may warn him of errors he is making in philosophy. It must be noted, however, that faith can tell a man that he is making an error. It does not necessarily tell him why the error was made or how to correct it. This is a properly philosophical task," unquote. Note that Klubertans does not make out theology to be the handmaid of philosophy, but rather that theology and the revealed dogmas believed by faith condition the believer not to take on erroneous philosophical beliefs. This is the sense in which faith helps philosophy. That is the sense in which the mold determines the form of the plasticity of the ideas. But remember that it's the revealed dogmas believed by faith and the mold itself as revealed that conditions what philosophical ideas are acceptable and what aren't, not the other way around. All this considered, we can therefore properly understand a rather controversial term. And that term is the development of doctrine. Beginning with the revealed theology, philosophy acts as a handmaid who explicates, refines, and crystallizes true doctrine. Consider the analogy, to whom I owe conceptual debt to J. Dyer, presented by these two images. Is the image on the left the same as the image on the right? Well, in a sense, no, because if I sold these two photos, I would have to charge significantly less for the one on the left. But in a sense, yes, because do both photos show the same object? Yes. Likewise, the revealed theology is no less present in the church by 787 AD at the Second Council of Nicaea than it was in 160 AD in the writings of St. Justin Martyr. St. Vincent of Lerins will further elucidate the concept for us in his commonatory. Quote, "But the Church of Christ, the careful and watchful guardian of the doctrines deposited in her charge, never changes anything in them, never diminishes, never adds, does not cut off what is necessary, does not add what is superfluous, does not lose her own, does not appropriate what is another's, but while dealing faithfully and judiciously with ancient doctrine keeps the one object carefully in view, if there be anything which antiquity has left shapeless and rudimentary, to fashion and polish it, if anything already reduced to shape and developed, to consolidate and strengthen it, if any already ratified and defined, to keep and guard it. Finally, what other object have councils ever aimed at in their decrees than to provide what was before believed in simplicity should in figure be believed intelligently, that what was before preached coldly should in future be preached earnestly, that what was before practised negligently should thenceforward be practised with double solicitude. This, I say, is what the Catholic Church, roused by the novelties of heresy, has accomplished by the decrees of her councils. For instance, the proper deity of our blessed Lord, by the word homoousios, consubstantial, of one substance, essence, or nature." Unquote. The fashioning, polishing, consolidating, and strengthening is the work of the handmaid who fashions and polishes the queen's belongings, consolidates and strengthens her household. Note how St. Vincent intimates how the rousing of heresies is the instigator for such activities. This means that absolutely any religion which holds to revealed dogmas is going to be pressed to adjudicate and explicate true accounts of the religion and false heretical ones. Does what St. Vincent say imply that the apostles knew less about the faith than later fathers? No, for reasons we will see in the last two sections of this presentation. On the origins of Islamic theology, eminent scholar Dr. Mufti Abdurrahman ibn Yusuf Mangera writes, quote, "The earlier generations had little need for a codified form of theology. Most of the time, Surat al-Ikhlas would suffice. Moreover, during the lifetime of Allah's Messenger, in particular whenever a question of faith or belief arose, he was there to answer it. There was no need then to formally systematize Aqidah, just as there was no need to do so for fiqh or tafsir, and other religious sciences. Seeing the danger posed to sacred Islamic knowledge by deviant individuals, ambitious politicians, and an increasingly troubled populace, scholars from each successive generation, in response to the exigencies of their respective times, compiled and systematized Islamic norms, ideas, and beliefs, and meticulously crafted the disciplines we recognize today." Unquote. Therefore, we can see a similar process was undergone in the early period of Islam, where creeds were written, along with extensive commentaries to counter heretical groups, which required philosophical acumen. Which leads us to a vital point in this presentation. Philosophy is absolutely inevitable, not only in a historical sense, in that it is impossible for a religious tradition to not be influenced by previous philosophical endeavours, but also for another reason we will see shortly. Dr. David Bradshaw, Orthodox professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky, explains how this historical inevitability relates to even the most fundamental of concepts such as what goodness is.
I try to go back to what did the Cappadocian Fathers, which is St. Basil, of course, and the two Gregories, Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory the Theologian, have to say that is still central at Orthodoxy, foundational really. One thing that I think is very important is what you would call their theological anthropology, their understanding of human nature in relation to God, and how we have already a kind of an innate knowledge of God prior to any conceptual thought. The reason we do is because one way of naming God, one way of thinking about who God is that God is the good. This is a concept that Plato had a lot to say about, Plato, Aristotle, even the Stoics. I'll talk about God as the good in the sense of that which is both the source of goodness for other things and the good that other things then naturally seek. This is what led in Neoplatonism to the concept of procession and return, that all things come forth from God, and insofar as they are, insofar as they sort of achieve real being, they return to God, whereas evil is precisely the failure to perform that act of return. And this can take different forms in different schools of ancient thought. But what they all have in common is that God is not just good in the sense you and I are good by, having a good character and performing good acts. He's good in these other ways that are more metaphysically fundamental, that other things are good only in relation to him insofar as they participate in what he is and imitate and exemplify what he is already, and insofar as they return to him in some sort of a relationship of, for the pagans it would have been contemplation, but of course for Christians is something much richer, it's obedience and worship.
Dr. Bradshaw also has an excellent lecture uploaded on YouTube called Heirs to Aristotle, which I will link in the description also. In it, he shows how Aristotelian thought was taken and modified by later theologians in various traditions, including Christianity and Islam. This happened because Aristotelian texts were being read by theologians, and the ideas within these texts had to be responded to, either by being challenged or recognizing the truth that was present. The late emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Beirut, Dr. Majid Fakhri, has a chapter in the Oxford History of Islamic Philosophy, which can be found online at the Oxford Islamic Studies website. It relates, quote, "Accordingly, Porphyry's isagoge and Aristotle's categories, hermeneutica, and the first part of prior analytics were translated into Syriac, laying the groundwork for their eventual translation into Arabic. It was left to Baghdad's Muslim logicians some centuries later, with the philosopher Abu Nasr al-Farabi leading the way, to break this tradition. These logicians eventually commented on or paraphrased the range of Aristotle's logical treatises, as well as his rhetoric and poetics, which were regarded as an integral part of the organon in the Syriac and Arabic traditions." Unquote. He further relates about the impact these Hellenic texts had influencing Islamic philosophers. Quote, "Neither the eclecticism of Al-Kindi nor the Platonism of Al-Razi was destined to determine the shape or direction of Islamic philosophy and give its characteristic stamp. Rather, an Islamic brand of Neoplatonism and Neo-Pythagoreanism, whose foundations were laid in the 10th century, played this role." Unquote. And relating on the figure of Imam al-Ash'ari, who is the founder of the largest and most important school of Islamic scholastic theology, historically and contemporaneously, essentially making up the Islamic orthodoxy, he writes, quote, "Thus, in methodology, he, al-Ash'ari, agreed with the Mutazilites that it was the duty of every reasonable Muslim, as he wrote in his Vindication of the Use of the Science of Kalam, to defer in those matters that are the subject of controversy, quote, to the body of principles consecrated by reason, sense experience, or common sense," unquote, as well as to the explicit pronouncement of the Quran and the Hadith. On all substantive issues, however, al-Ash'ari diverged from his Mutazilite masters and embraced the traditionalist or Hanbali perspective, unquote. In orthodoxy, we trust the Church, guided by the Holy Spirit, to be able to properly sift between acceptable and unacceptable philosophical ideas. The other kind of inevitability, apart from the historical kind, is conditioned by an even more fundamental inevitability, namely, that the use of philosophy as such is totally unavoidable if rational discourse, understanding the world, and grasping at truth are valid enterprises. It is simply impossible to communicate or even go around day-to-day life without having at least some theory of metaphysics, epistemology, or ethics, such that even the rejection of philosophy is itself an exercise in philosophy. The minute one begins to explain why he rejects philosophy, he will inevitably begin to have recourse to his own purported answers to the fundamental questions I have mentioned. St. John of Damascus elaborates on this point, quote, "There are, however, some people who have endeavoured to do away entirely with philosophy by asserting that it does not exist, and that neither does knowledge or perception exist. We shall answer them by asking, how is it that you say that there is neither philosophy nor knowledge nor perception? Is it by your knowing and perceiving it? Or is it by your not knowing and perceiving it? If you have perceived it, well, that is knowledge and perception. But if it is by your not knowing it, then so no one will believe you as long as you are discussing something of which you have no knowledge." Unquote. So we can see that when one is required to give an explanation for their beliefs, especially when put under the microscope, philosophy is simply inevitable. Clubertans corroborates this, quote, "Man is also an intellectual animal. Almost as soon as he can talk, he is asking what and why. All his life, he wants to know what is going on and why. True enough, most people let the preoccupation of biological life limit their questions to what is immediately practical, in the narrow sense of useful. But man remains a questioning animal, and in itself this tendency to question is not limited to a particular set of questions, to a particular class of things. It is open to literally everything, and in its deepest reality. It has been well said that man is a being who questions being, and primarily perhaps even his own being. Our contemporary culture both reinforces this tendency and turns aside from it. On the one hand, we are constantly questioning ourselves and our world, our art and our literature, and are the most introspective. Even common conversation turns on the hidden feelings and motives of ourselves and others. World problems make us question our common values and our ways of attempting to realize them. On the other hand, this very questioning is sophisticated and fearful. It questions with more than half a mind that our analysis, not a revelation of the truth, and with somewhat of a fear of the answers we might find if we push the question far enough. But to satisfy the profound needs which man has, the intellectual sphere of his activities must be enlarged. What he is, what the world is, which not only surrounds him and supports him, but also influences him. These are questions which sooner or later come to a reflective person. Consequently, to reach the perfection of his rationality, a person must come to grips with the ultimate questions which are asked in philosophy." Unquote. Special revelation does not give us an exhaustive account of the detailed answers to questions like these, if such an account is to be had, which is a philosophical question in itself. But it does condition and properly frame the answers and line of inquiry that can be had. So what are these questions? Some in the realm of metaphysic Clubertans suggest include, quote, "What is it to be real? Why do we call a thing a being? Is there more than one kind of reality? What is change? Is every being changeable, or is there unchanging permanent reality? Is being simple or complex? Is being limited or unlimited? Is a limited being caused? How many kinds of causes are there? What are truth and goodness? What is an individual? A person? Is there a cause of the various beings which we experience? Is this cause God? What kind of being is God, and what is his relationship to us?" Unquote. In Christianity, the answers to these questions about God are determined by the tradition of the Church and the lives of the saints. For us, Christianity is the true philosophy, insofar as every aspect of philosophy as I have properly defined it is incorporated and baptized into the Christian religious worldview, which has its foundations in the prophets, our Lord's witness to the apostles who faithfully handed them down, and the Holy Fathers who kept them, as St. Vincent explains. This is why ultimately in Orthodox Christianity, mysticism cannot be separated from theology. As Vladimir Lossky points out in his The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, quote, "The term mystical theology denotes no more than a spirituality which expresses a doctrinal attitude. In a certain sense, all theology is mystical, inasmuch as it shows forth the divine mystery, the data of revelation." Unquote. Which leads us to our penultimate slide about the Orthodox ideal of the philosopher-theologian, the man who prays. We will therefore see how, for the Orthodox Christian, philosophy properly defined is aspectual and really forms part of a larger understanding of philosophy. Its true and complete integration as part of a whole mode of living. Dr. Bradshaw gives a good preliminary explanation.
And there were many philosophical sects in the ancient world. And a wonderful sort of portrayal of that is in the Dialogue with Trypho by St. Justin Martyr. He describes how he was a student of ancient pagan philosophy. And he visited all these different sects, or teachers of each one of these different sects, to try to learn the philosophy, to try to find the true philosophy from that teacher. And finally he went to a Platonist, and the Platonist was the one who said, "Yes, I will teach you, and I will teach you a philosophy that is aimed at knowing God." Because that's what Justin really wanted. He wanted to know God. And so he learned the philosophy of the Platonists, and he was taken into it and persuaded until he was out alone one night taking a walk, and he met someone, a stranger, who started questioning him about his philosophy. Justin really didn't have a good answer for those questions. So he was frustrated and ashamed, and he was really more angry, I think, at reason itself, you might say, than anything else, because he felt like he had found the true philosophy, and here it had let him down again. and he was almost in despair. But this stranger that he was with explained to him, well, the trouble isn't philosophy, the trouble is that you've been seeking wisdom from human teachers, and you've been ignoring those who are inspired by God. And so he told him about the prophets of the Old Testament and how they prophesied the coming of the Messiah, and how those prophecies were fulfilled in Christ. And how ever since the apostles and the disciples of Christ have been endowed with his divine power and have themselves the power of miracles, and the church has, which is his body on earth, continues his life here today. And so Justin wanted to learn this philosophy, and whenever he writes about Christianity, he refers to it as simply our philosophy, or sometimes as the true philosophy, as opposed to all these pagan philosophies that were sort of trying to get there but didn't have the fullness of the truth. And the later church fathers adopted this way of thinking, that Christianity is the true philosophy. In fact, Clement of Alexandria, he refers to it as the divine and barbarous philosophy. Because it's barbarous because it becomes from the Jews and not the Greeks. And yet it's divine because it's found in the teaching of divinely inspired prophets and teachers. So that, I think, is how we should think about the relationship of Christianity to philosophy, that Christianity provides for us what philosophy properly is seeking but can never achieve, which is true divine wisdom.
St. Gregory the Theologian's approach to the knowledge of God is most instructive, namely that one must be undergoing a process of purification to be able to have such knowledge. St. Gregory says, quote, "It is not for everyone, people. Philosophizing about God is not for everyone. It is not something that can be bought at a cheap price, or those who crawl on the ground. What's more, it is not for every occasion, or every audience, or every subject. But there is a proper time and audience and subject. It is not for everyone, because it is for those who have been tested and have found a sure footing in contemplation, and most importantly, who have been purified in soul and body, or at the very least are being purified. For it is dangerous for someone who is not pure to lay hold of what is pure, just as it is for weak eyes to gaze at the brightness of the sun." Unquote. For St. Gregory, Orthodox philosophy begins with the fear of God and the transformation of our lives which the gospel requires. This active endeavour paradoxically makes us have the necessary passivity for the reception of divine illumination, which makes the Christian properly disposed to knowledge of God. Professor of Patristics at Yale University Christopher Beeley expounds, quote, "Yet for all his knowledge of Greek philosophy, Gregory is concerned above all with setting the pagan and Christian philosophies in contrast with one another. Pagan philosophy, he says, plays with shadows of the truth under the cloak and guise of philosophy, whereas Christian philosophy, although it may in all appearance be lowly, is inwardly sublime and leads to God. After severely criticizing the various Hellenistic schools, he concludes that it is the Christian who serves the well-being of all, who is really the lover of wisdom, as opposed to those who lack it." Unquote. So it is properly the role of Christian life and faith to make one disposed to the light which exposes those things that cast the shadows. Our previous analogy of the mould only takes us a certain useful distance, but it really has its fulfillment in orthodoxy. So Gregory makes a poignant observation which Dr. Beeley gives commentary on, quote, "What will you conceive the deity to be if you rely on the approximation of reason?" Unquote. His answer is that the knowledge of God's being comes only by the Holy Spirit, which searches the depths of God. A second such text is Gregory's statement that the mind either makes visible things into gods, or else it, quote, "discovers God through the beauty and order of visible things." Unquote. However, here he is contrasting the idolatry of the created things in the history of religion with the way in which we are meant to know God through them. Rather than exalting reason as being capable of knowing God independently, Gregory's point is that apart from faith and grace, reason is profoundly incapable of knowing God with any accuracy or saving benefit. Unquote. So to answer the earlier question about St. Vincent's implications, no, the apostles did not know less than the later fathers, precisely because true knowledge of God is not primarily characterized by philosophical discursive reasoning, but rather by purification and relation with God himself, whom the apostles and prophets were in the chief place to have experienced. This leads us to our final slide, one of utmost importance to remember, when we are trying to ascend the mountain and are employing philosophy in our quest. That thing to remember is the inevitability of mystery in religious worldviews. Mystery is simply the idea that some questions about the divine are just impious to ask, or the answers to which are, quite frankly, not possible to be wholly grasped or circumscribed by the intellect. St. Gregory Nazianzen explains mystery from scripture and mystical experience. Quote, "What happened to me, friends and initiates and fellow lovers of the truth? I was running to comprehend God, and so I went up into the mountain and came through the cloud and entered away from matter and material things, and as far as I could, I withdrew within myself. Then when I looked up, I barely saw the back parts of God, and in this I was sheltered by the rock, the Word that was made flesh for us. When I looked a little closer, I saw, not the first and pure nature which is known to itself, to the Trinity I mean, and that part of it that abides within the first veil and is hidden by the cherubim, but only that part of it that is posterior and comes down to us. This is, as far as I know, God's majesty that is manifested among the creatures that he has produced and governs, or as holy David calls it, God's glory. For these are the back parts of God which he leaves behind as tokens of himself, like the shady reflections of the sun in the water, which show the sun to our weak eyes because we cannot look at the sun itself, for by its unmixed light it defeats our perception. In this way, then, you shall do theology, even if you are a Moses and a god to Pharaoh, even if you are caught up like Paul to the third heaven, and heard unspeakable words, even if you are raised above them both, and exalted to angelic or archangelic status and rank. For even if something is all heavenly, or even above heaven, much higher in nature than we are and nearer to God, it is still farther from God and from the complete comprehension of him. Then it rises above our complex and lowly and earthward sinking composition." Unquote. For how could it be the case that God, who we confess is utterly unique among all things and transcends all of creation, could possibly be fully understood by our finite created minds, whilst we have yet to even have an exhaustive account of creaturely reality? St. Basil states how blasphemous this idea is, which was held by the Eunomian heretics. Quote, "If these things are beyond the understanding of those who have attained the measure of the knowledge of Paul, how great is the conceit of those who profess to know the substance of God? I would like to ask them about the earth upon which they stand, and from which they come. What do they say? What do they tell us is its substance? If they were to argue incontrovertibly about what lies on the ground and under their feet, we would believe them even when they concern themselves with the things beyond every notion. But it seems that self-conceit is the most difficult of all the passions in human beings, since in actual fact, it envelops those whom it affects in the condemnations of the devil. Hence, those who have no understanding of the nature of the earth on which they trample go so far as to brag that they have penetrated the very substance of the God of the universe." Unquote. Again, how could we even, who do not through our scientific endeavours have an exhaustive account of the precise nature and functioning of every aspect of creation, have such an exhaustive account of the divine? In fact, with every so-called progress in the physical sciences, the more we come to know, the more that knowledge is accompanied by uncertainties. This principle is also clearly universally present in Islamic theological tradition. The Oxford Dictionary of Islam, edited by Dr. John Esposito, professor of Islamic Studies at Georgetown University, corroborates this idea when defining the often used in Islamic theology Arabic term billa kayfa. Quote, "Billa kayfa, without asking or knowing how, used in Islamic theological texts and discussions to avoid anthropomorphical discussions of God by delineating the manner in which God exists, acts, and so on, positing instead that God's mode of being is beyond human comprehension." Unquote. An instance of its many conceptual uses is found in the narration involving Imam Malik, one of the founders of the four schools of Sunni jurisprudence, who was asked about istiwa, which is the revealed knowledge in the Quran that Allah rises above his throne, contained in Surah 7, Ayah 54. Imam Malik is asked, quote, "How is istiwa?" He, Imam Malik, said, "Istiwa is known, its manner is unknown, believing in it is obligatory, and asking about it is bid'ah, religious innovation." Unquote. So we see how both Christian and Islamic traditions have the concept of mystery, which is utterly unavoidable for any religious worldview which confesses a transcendent God as author of the cosmos. It is true that the topic of whether a particular religious subject matter can be validly classed as mystery is a separate question, but admitting the principle of mystery is tantamount to any religion professing a God whose nature, in the loose sense, is not circumscribable by the intellect, since a God who is circumscribable is not God at all. Generally, unless something is explicitly revealed to have an aspect of mystery to it, it is possible to do philosophical work to explicate it faithfully, and adhering to the dogmas whilst always remembering our limited state and the words of St. Gregory concerning purification. Otherwise, refuting accusations of incoherence should be sufficient. In conclusion, the two questions we started off with have been answered. Does philosophy have a place in religious worldviews? Absolutely yes, and we have shown that it is in fact unavoidable for philosophy to have a place in religious worldviews, which is also why the answer to the second question, is it possible to reject philosophy, is unequivocally no. We have examined how orthodoxy is really the religion which truly takes on philosophy to its full potential and in its right place. Finally, we have learned that mystery is as unavoidable as philosophy in religion. Thank you all for listening. I hope you have a great upcoming Holy Week and a glorious Resurrection Day.